senior developer positions in the Boston Autodesk office, and there's a product owner position in the either Boston or Manchester, New Hampshire office.
Would you mind giving your name so people, if they can't find you in the gallery since we have so many people?
Sure, I'm Jackie Watson. I'm a senior experience designer at Autodesk.
Thanks, Jackie.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
So I have two at IBM. There's in Littleton, Mass. They're looking for a senior design manager and a senior UX designer, I believe, both for AI applications. So reach out to me, Jessica Welch. Yeah. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have an opening for UX designer for a social app. That is basically for a web design and a mobile design. And the opening is open. I think they can remotely, but it's better too because we our software designer in California, Silicon Valley. So it's better if like nearby, San Francisco or Bay Area will be great. But it's remote is fun because it's fun. We can have a lot of online tools to work together. So we would like to have one opening out that area. So if there's some person interested, we would like to have this opportunity to get in touch with them. Thank you.
Right. And what was the name of the company again?
Candor.
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 Yeah.
And do you pronounce your name Hydrangea?
Yeah.
Flower?
That's
Beautiful.
beautiful. Love it. Yes.
Thank you.
Mhm. Any other jobs?
Hi, this is Joe Amico, and I'm with Aetna Digital. We are looking for a UX researcher, if anyone is interested.
Great. Excellent. So if anybody is on the Slack channel, please feel free to add those to the jobs or Slack workspace, add it to the jobs channel. That would be great as well, just to share them out, or on our Facebook group too. Just the more eyes, the better, to hopefully help you find those roles that you need.
Yeah. And if you haven't joined the Slack channel, the invite for that is on the Facebook group. So you can go ahead and click that.
Yeah.
to join.
That's right. Yes, it is. Yeah, the link for that is there. Awesome. Well, now we get to turn it over to Amy, and I just wanted to tell you all a little bit about her first. So Amy is the VP of Behavior Change Design at MadPal. She's been there for about 4 years. Is that right? I believe that's right. And she's also the author of the book Engaged, which is super exciting, which actually just came out this week, right, Amy?
March 3rd.
March 3rd.
Yeah, not the best timing for a book launch as it turned out, but we didn't know.
Oh, no, but it still works, right? You're still able to do these remotely, hopefully, and get them out. Yeah. But before switching it over, I just wanted to remind everyone just to stay on mute if you can until we do some Q&A. Then we would love for you to come off mute and participate. We were thinking that with the camera sharing that we would try to limit it unless you were talking, just in case people have bandwidth issues and they're having trouble seeing Amy. So maybe during the talk we don't share until the end. And there is an ability to raise your hand so that Amy can see that you have a question, so please feel free to do that. I think it's in the participants panel on the right underneath.
Yeah.
So right now I will make Amy the host, and that way, Amy, you can control hand faces, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do that more.
Like it will let me share.
Yep, you're sharing.
Okay, that just did a very weird thing though to my, is it just sharing the slides?
Now we see the slides.
Yep.
Okay, now that's looking more like what I expected to. Great.
I guess one note, if people are new to Zoom, I'm seeing only a portion of the slide, but if you go up to the very top of the window, you should see a view options dropdown. And if you select fit to window, you should be able to see her whole slide versus seeing it at a different percent. It doesn't automatically default to that. So if anybody's having weird magnification, just hit that fit to window.
That's great.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to try to keep this a little bit on the shorter side because I'd like there to be time for discussion. And I wasn't kidding about the beer. I have some smutty nose and I put it in a Maine State Police koozie to shout out to the people from Maine who I thought might be in the crowd. So cheers.
Cheers.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit today about behavior change design, what it is, and how you can use it to build products that people actually really enjoy and want to engage with. It's still, behavior change design is still a relatively new field. I've been doing it for about 15 years now, but it was definitely a case of cobbling together bits and pieces of different types of jobs and different toolkits in the beginning. And it's only in the last few years that I have been able to sort of join forces and meet up with other people who've done the same sort of thing over the years and put together their own behavior change design toolkits. So it's a really exciting time in that it's becoming an actual job. It's now like a job title you can search for, which wasn't the case for a lot of my career. And I think it's becoming a much more accessible set of tools and approaches in general in the design world. So I'm really excited about that. So what the heck does a behavior change designer do? And I'll say right off the bat, the thing I always run into is this misperception that it's about controlling people. It's about having a set of tricks that you can deploy to make people do what you want them to do. And that is not the case for two reasons. One reason is it's just not that simple. People are pretty complicated. So we know a lot about what makes them tick, but not enough that we can pull strings like they're puppets. And the second reason is that that's just unethical. And I think similar to other fields like medicine, we're seeing in behavior change and in design more broadly that we do want to have some sort of ethical code of conduct. And I think that's a really important aspect of the job because these are tools that could be abused. So I just always like to call that out up front. And I've definitely had some people where I tell them what I do and their knee-jerk reaction is quite negative because they assume it's this puppet master thing. So just want to put that out there that in fact, the way that I approach it and the way that a lot of my peers in the field approach it is really much more about helping facilitate people reaching goals that they care about and not about achieving something that we put in front of them. So to give you a definition that's not grounded in the negative, behavior change designers facilitate the ability of people to work toward goals by designing interventions. And interventions is just the catch-all term that I use for the products that I work on, whether they're digital or whether they're experiences or more of a service design type of output. But anything that helps change people's behavior by addressing barriers to them doing that behavior and then promoting any sort of conditions that make it easier for them to do those behaviors. And I see behavior change design as living in the intersection of user experience and behavior science. So I was trained as a psychologist, I have a PhD in psychology, and I know how to do all the traditional, human subjects research through laboratory settings. And those skills are very useful in my day job, but I really work in the world of design, and a lot of the tools in my toolkit come from the UX design world. So it's really, I think, living in the intersection of the two, and I wouldn't have it any other way because I really love what I pull from both fields. In terms of what behavior change designers focus on when we build products or do research, if you think about the continuum of time that people are engaged with something, first of all, upfront is effective engagement. Like, how do we get them to use a product in the first place? How do we make it interesting to them? How do we put it in the world in a way that they'll cross paths with it and it will ping as relevant? Uptake is about how do we actually get people to use it once they're aware of it. Behavior change is really, in many ways, the most important piece of it. How do we get people to do something differently as a result of interacting with our intervention or our product? And then action here is a little bit misleadingly named, I think, because it's really about testing. It's about collecting data at many points of the process to understand whether the thing we built is working or not, and hopefully to iterate based on what we learn. And I'll go into more detail about what that looks like. The process that we use at MadPow, and I think the labels could be anything really, but the labels that we choose to use for the stages that we go through are diagnose, prescribe, implement, and evaluate, where diagnosis is our early research. It's our formative research where we really try to understand the problem space. And that's also where we will explore some of the toolkits of behavior science to figure out which ones we'd like to apply. Prescribe is where we start to figure out what a solution might look like. So that's where we might be putting together some requirements, some early prototypes, doing some test and learn, and figuring out what is this thing we're going to build. Implement is when we actually build it. And in my case, my personal toolkit does not really include visual design or interaction design. So in this case, I'm often working really closely with colleagues to help them take the things from the prescribe stage and implement them with fidelity. But I'm not typically the person who's drawing or coding them myself. And then lastly, evaluate is when we test and see if the thing that we've built works. And I have all the arrows here because really evaluation is something that happens all throughout. And you all know this, the user experience crowd is not the group that I need to make this point to in as much detail as some other ones. We really want to be testing at as many points in the process as possible, really bringing users into the process so that we can know from the very earliest stages if we're on track, if we're building something that's useful and usable and delightful. I know, I'm sorry, the word delightful. One thing about behavior change design that is a little different from other design specialty areas is that for us, behaviors always come first. The very, very first step in any project is to define what we call target behaviors, which are the specific things that we want people to change. And one thing that I do a lot, and I know my colleague Dustin DiTomaso does this as well, because I borrowed some of these things from his list, is actually quiz people about what is a behavior, because it's not always, it's the sort of thing, it's so simple you think you know it, but you don't think about it critically, so you make mistakes. So in terms of which ones are behaviors here, I'll just give you a second to look at these and just think about which ones of these are behaviors and which ones are maybe not behaviors. All right. So, and this is how they actually sort out. So about half of them are behaviors: walking in the park, taking a pill, reading a chapter a night, saving $100 a month, practicing Spanish vocabulary. You'll notice these are all pretty specific and they are very measurable. So they're something that you can observe people doing for the most part. The ones on the other side here are not things that people necessarily do. They may be things that people feel or think. So feeling confident is a good example, or wanting to make a change, being happy. Those are emotional states. Those are, mental, they're internal to the person. Losing weight is an outcome, but it is not in and of itself a behavior. It's the result of behaviors like moving more and burning calories, consuming fewer calories, those kinds of things. And then preparing for retirement, I put in red because depending on how you define that, it could actually be a behavior if it looks like something like sitting down and making a plan and then setting money aside in order to reach a target savings amount. But as written, it's kind of iffy. It's probably not a behavior. So one of the very first steps of any of our projects is to sit down and go through this disciplined exercise of thinking, what are the behaviors that we are trying to change in the people who use the intervention that we're about to build? Part of selecting that, so honestly, a lot of it is really just generating an exhaustive list of the things that we could try to get people to change that are related to the outcomes our client, and I do work for a consulting organization, so in my case, it's always a client. If you work in-house, obviously you'd frame it slightly differently. But if their objective is to, help people with hypertension, reduce hospitalizations, and over time use less medication, we would generate a pretty exhaustive list of all the different behaviors we could look to have people do that would lead to those outcomes. But then ultimately we need to prioritize and select just a few to focus on. And so we ask questions like, which ones of these behaviors are most likely to get to those goals? So we might actually look at the research literature, we often do, to figure out, in previous studies, in previous interventions, what behaviors made the biggest difference in terms of people reaching these types of outcomes. Okay, if it was physical activity, let's try to focus on that because that's going to make the biggest difference. That's the bang for the buck. We also want to think about whether we actually have access to the people who do that behavior. So, we're always constrained by real world considerations. One example, I actually presented this at UXPA Boston a few years ago, and I had a woman come and speak to me afterwards, and she was pretty upset, and I think there was some validity to her concerns, but she was upset because I had presented about a project that I had done about construction worker safety. And we ultimately built a training program that was, incorporated some of what we had learned about what was leading construction workers to take risks on the job site. And her point was that seems a little bit blamey of the worker, that there are a lot of things about the workplace conditions, about the management that we're leading people to feel forced into these behaviors, and to arrive at training as the solution feels like you're putting the blame on the worker incorrectly. And I hear that. We were unfortunately or fortunately operating under the constraint of what our client was willing to, build and pay for as an output of that. So those are the sorts of considerations that we do bring in early in the process to make sure that whatever it is we're building fits the business situation as well as the sort of outcome situation we're driving toward. And then, can we influence people within the constraints of our toolkit? So if we don't have any access to anything related to pharmacy, it might not be the right choice to focus on medication adherence. It really depends on, what our reach is and what our toolkit is. So really bringing in those practical considerations. Not all behaviors are equal. So there are behaviors that are very simple, like clicking on a link. And sometimes that is the objective of our project. You really want to get people to use something digital. And that's about, driving their interest with that project or product and keeping them kind of hooked on it. That in terms of the behavior change toolkit you need to bring to it is not super complex. You get to something that's like learning how to run and training for a race. You think about the amount of time that takes. If you're talking about somebody who's never exercised before, your behavior change toolkit is going to be a little bit deeper here. And then you get all the way up to some of these more complicated health behavior change issues. So the one at the top here, and this is just based on my own career experience. There are lots of non-health examples, but my career has primarily focused in health, and so it's the example set that I tend to gravitate towards. Think about something like managing a chronic health condition. So something like diabetes, where you may also have comorbidities. And you have to think about medication, you have to think about diet, exercise. All these things are quite complicated. And when you have to consider them all at once, you're really asking people to do a lot sometimes in terms of their behavior change. And so you have to bring, a kind of complex framework and thinking to that issue. Another first step, and this is one where I do want to go into a little bit more detail toward the end, is building an outcomes plan. And sometimes these are called outcomes logic models, but it's basically planning for the results that you hope to get as a very first sort of action. And the reason you do that, there's two reasons. One is you make sure that you are prepared to actually measure along the way. And again, if you want to iterate and kind of course correct as you're working, it's important to know what type of data you're going to want to look at. So it's really a matter of just sitting down and planning that in the first place. And I plan them from a leading to a lagging time frame. So what are the things that we see first? So you can collect baseline measurements of your users on day one. You can see pretty quickly, it's like, think about a digital program. Are they downloading it? Are they logging in and creating accounts? Are they actually using it? Which parts of it are they using? All of those things are important, because if you're building any sort of intervention into the product, you want to make sure that people are using them. But then the behavior changes, that's the piece that often takes place offline with a digital product. So this is stuff that people are often doing in their daily lives in their homes. And you want to think about how can you detect those behavior changes and how can you understand if they're really happening. And so you may need to be thinking about things here like, do you want to do a survey study of your users, or do you want to have them come back to your product and provide you with additional data? Do you want them to be using a connected device so that you can kind of see an ongoing real-time glimpse into whether they're doing the behavior? So there's some thought there about how to get to that. And then the long-term outcomes are often the things that clients are really concerned about, the problem that they bring to you in the first place, where they will say, I need to reduce costs, or we need to get people to take this medication as prescribed, because right now they're not doing that. So those oftentimes are kind of the big, more abstract goals, and the behavior changes are going to ladder up into them. So this is an example that shows this completely filled out. If you were to go through this exercise, and the example here is for reducing hypertension. It's not from a real product. It's something that I put together for the book with help from a colleague. But you might take these baseline measurements on day 0 during onboarding to a product. Then you can measure their exposure metrics, their participation and engagement ongoing, but you have that data very early. And you might be able to tell, like, hey, there's really important information on this page, but nobody's ever hitting it. So that tells you need to think about your user flow and go back and iterate a little bit. The behavior changes in this particular example, we have measured via survey every 3 months. And it might include things like going to a doctor's appointment. Did you actually do that? And then the long-term outcomes you often can measure through other data. So in the healthcare world, sometimes we have access to things like health claims data or pharmacy fill data if we're working with a pharmacy or an integrated health system. And those sorts of things will give you that objective measure of whether or not this thing worked. And I mentioned there's 2 reasons we do this first. The second one is you do want to make sure you're building all the right active ingredients into your product. So if you know that going to the doctors is a really important thing that people have to do to be successful in your, as part of the area that you're helping them with, you should probably say something somewhere about going to the doctor, maybe offer some advice or assistance with that. So doing this whole outcomes plan first helps you identify some of the specific ingredients you might want to include. So interventions, I mentioned that's kind of the catch-all term for anything I work on. They affect what people do. They might affect how often they do it or how long they do it for, when they do it. It's not always a new behavior. BJ Fogg has a behavior grid that I think does a nice job of laying out how people might be doing something that's totally new, or it might be about doing something they already do more or less, stopping it. You can think about it that way. In terms of what interventions are, one of the things I did in writing my book early on, I tried to crowdsource some stuff. So I went on to Twitter and LinkedIn and I asked people to suggest their favorite behavior change apps to me. And I was really surprised at the mix I got. A lot of things were suggested that really weren't behavior change, but they were related to health maybe, or related to finance. And I think that there's this kind of assumption that if you're working in those fields, it is behavior change, but that's not always true. So these are a couple examples of things that I consider to be interventions because they're trying to change behavior. So Nagbot does exactly what its name says. Wobot's really cool. It's a chatbot. It's intended for adolescent males who are having emotional struggles, maybe subclinical depression or anxiety, and they don't have a trusted person to talk to. So I think it's a really, really nicely done chatbot, but the purpose of it is try to get people to improve their emotional state by talking about how they feel. Headspace meditation, that's an activity that you're supposed to engage in regularly to reap the results. Stash Invest is, helps novice investors figure out how to put their money into growth vehicles. So these are all targeting behaviors and they're all targeting doing something different. These are other apps that are not really interventions. So this is Untapped. I will put my Smutty Nose beer into my Untapped after we finish this session, but it doesn't really, it gives you badges. I don't know why, because it doesn't change behavior. Spotify, and then Facebook could be used as part of an intervention. There are interventions that live within Facebook, in fact, but in and of itself, it is not. It's not really designed to change any one specific behavior. I mentioned that a lot of the behaviors we care about happen offline, so we try to understand behavior in context. A lot of our research is really about talking to people about how they experience the behavior or things that are adjacent to the behavior now, and trying to identify levers that we might be able to pull to make that behavior easier for them to do, or harder if it's something we want them to stop. So this is just a particular model that shows, thinking about the different layers of context a person lives in. We draw on a lot of theories and frameworks. This is not even an exhaustive list, but these are some of the ones that we most often use. And at the beginning of most projects, we have to make a decision, like what is the framework that we're going to use as our major lens for understanding behavior and designing an intervention. So when we choose a framework, and I'll be honest, I have a couple of favorites and I'll just quickly share them with you in a moment, but the broader set of questions you want to ask is this framework applicable to this topic or problem area? These frameworks all have long research histories, and some of them are really Stages of Change is one that a lot of people have heard of before. It's got a lot of research in smoking cessation. It's a very decent framework to pull for if you're doing a smoking cessation project. There's much less evidence related to that framework in other areas, so you might not go with it if you were working on a different topic. You'd also want to look at, does it have a strong and recent evidence base? Some of these theories have fallen out of favor, not necessarily because they're bad, but just because there are other theories that do a better job of explaining things. Sometimes it's not even about the quality of the theory, it just became unpopular. But in any case, you want to look for something that has some more recent evidence behind it. And then if you use it, will it actually give you something that you can do? There are a lot of behavior change approaches that are extremely interesting, but ultimately not super actionable. And if you're working in the design field, that's not usually helpful because our goal is really to build something, to do something. So this is one model that I use a lot, the COM-B model, and it basically, in a nutshell, says that in order for a person to do a behavior, they have to have the capability, the motivation, and the opportunity to do it. And the way that I use this particular framework, it helps me to structure my research. So I can, if I'm doing interviews, for example, ask people about things that may affect their capability, their motivation, their opportunity. Or if I'm doing observations, that's another method of research that this lends itself very nicely to. And then I can code my data according to this. And there's another piece to this framework that I'm not going to show you, where you can basically follow a decision tree and say, oh, there's a reflective motivation difficulty with this behavior. The set of interventions that might help fall into these categories. So it's a nice way to winnow down your solution set using research. So I use this framework quite a bit. Another one I use a lot is self-determination theory of motivation. And this is really about why somebody would want to do a behavior and what would keep them interested in doing a behavior over the long term. So here, I hate when I forget to remove the build on this one. But basically, the types of motivation that are longest lasting are the ones that are personal to people. So if you have a goal, or if you consider yourself a certain type of person, and you see a behavior that supports that, you're going to be much more interested in doing it, and you're going to be more interested in sticking with it, even if it's hard. So when I use this in developing a product or an intervention, I try to understand what makes people tick. What are they really interested in doing? And are there ways that I can align these behaviors with the things they already care about? Part of what I can do with this theory too that I like a lot is support people's basic psychological needs. So the 3 basic psychological needs, and I'm seeing this a lot now with people under lockdown, because I think our current situation makes all 3 of these needs a little bit harder to express and to feel supported in. But we all have a need for autonomy, making meaningful choices, competence, feeling like when we interact with the world, it's actually doing something, and relatedness, so feeling connected to others. And when we can craft experiences or products that support these 3 things, that's what gets people more interested, and it's what helps them make those connections between what they're doing and what they care about. So it offers design opportunities. Literature review, these are 2 screenshots of actual literature reviews I've worked on, just little snippets of them. But in our projects, we go back to the published research and we review it, and we try to build off of what's already known. So I think that is, I know other areas of UX, like our UX research team at MadPow certainly does go back and do reviews of existing research, but it's a little bit different in behavior change in that we tend to go into kind of the academic journals, and sometimes we're doing things that are a little bit adjacent. So it might be like, let's review everything about hypertension reduction through the doctor's office. And but trying to pull the lessons learned out of that so that we don't repeat things that didn't work, and so that we can build on things that did. One thing about behavior change design is sometimes we do call in the bigger guns. So if we're doing work, for example, in a really heavily regulated product environment, and I come across this most often in pharma or investment products, we would oftentimes work with a subject matter expert who might be internal to our client, or might be somebody that we seek out and hire. Similarly, if there's a really complex medical issue and we need somebody who has more of that clinical knowledge base, we would rather reach out to that person and include them than make a mistake and not offer an effective product to people. And then sometimes we encounter needing deep knowledge about a specific population. So I haven't encountered this as much at MadPow, but cross-cultural work is one where I've found this before, where you really want somebody who maybe has lived in a particular culture, is native to that culture, and can provide that viewpoint that you really can't ever get as an outsider. I mentioned the building the thing part, working closely with colleagues to make that happen. So this is just an example of how 3 behavior change concepts, these are all behavior change techniques that come out of that COM-B model I just shared with you. And they're kind of fuzzy, right? Like commitment, self-monitoring behavior, goal setting. Like, what is that? Well, here on the right, you can see a sample of what those might actually look like in an app. And so a lot of what we do is we, sit down with our colleagues who are on other types of design teams, and we help to create this translation. And in my case, I make really awful looking hand drawings for them that I'm sure test their patience. And then finally, at the end of a project, like once something's out in the world, we will test for effectiveness and efficacy. And these are two slightly different things. This is an area where I sometimes bump up against my colleagues who are more in the like science and academia side of behavior change. Because when you're trained academically, you learn about testing for efficacy. You basically learn how to test in a laboratory, and you're controlling your environment. You're making it so that you're really looking at, does this thing work if all else is equal? And with design, you're often creating products that immediately get put out into the real world. You don't have an opportunity to do a clinical trial of it. That's not 100% true. Like sometimes with digital therapeutics, for example, you can do that clinical trial, but oftentimes our products are going straight into the hands of consumers, and we still do want to understand if they're making a difference. And so effectiveness is the term that refers to more of that real world. Is it producing results, given all of the other noise that that is going on for people? So these are just some of the types of studies that we might do, and they're organized loosely. Randomized control trials are that gold standard where everything is really strictly controlled, and you can say with certainty, like, yeah, this thing made a difference. Going all the way down through more, something like a case study or a survey is probably less rigorous, but will still give you good insight into whether it worked and what you might need to do differently. I always just like to remind people that outcomes are the way that you tell your story. So when you're thinking about collecting data on your product, I mean, think about what story you want to tell to people about why they should use this or why they should buy it. What is the information that you need to collect in order to make that the case, to make that true. So in terms of getting started on this, practicing behavior change design, I do get asked a lot, things like, do I need a special educational background, et cetera, et cetera. And you really don't. I think anybody who's working in UX probably already has the mindset of a behavior change designer in many ways. You're working from a place of empathy most of the time. You're really thinking about your users. And those are the same sorts of mindsets that are forward with behavior change design. So it's often really a matter of making those tools more accessible and figuring out when and how to use them, as opposed to, going to school for years and years. So start small and build, like try a couple things, maybe do a lit review and see if you find that helpful on a project. Try 1-2 things. Think about growing your skill set. So I do have lists of books and articles that I recommend to people. There's a lot of really great podcasts. Like podcasts are just booming, and I'm always finding, like, I'm kind of overwhelmed by how many good podcasts I have to listen to. I can't get to them all anymore. And then just also remember too, that if you try something and you get stuck, it's not that hard to call on experts. There are more and more people like myself now who are behavior change designers who consider that part of their role. And as the field grows, you're going to find that those people are more accessible to you. So I will pause there. Just 2 more quick things. So Engage Designing for Behavior Change is my book. It is out. It's available in paperback and e-reader. I get asked these things. That's why I put them on here. Rosenfeld Media is the primary place to buy it. It is on Amazon. They have a shipping lag on it, and Rosenfeld Media is a small business and they're awesome. So if you can purchase there, please do. And if you do purchase there, we have a code, Engaged CHXD, that will give you 20% off. And they do ship internationally. People ask me that as well. So yes, they do. And then I know you've already heard about HXD. We did go virtual. We made the decision to go virtual fairly early before a lot of other conferences had canceled, which sucked. It was really a hard decision because it's our 10th anniversary this year, but it gave us a little bit of an advantage in terms of some more time to think about how to transform it to a digital event, a virtual event. And I am excited that I think we've still got a really strong speaker lineup. We've actually been able to get some people who wouldn't be able to participate if it were in person. And the team has been thinking really hard about how to make it interactive and try to preserve some of those networking things that make this particular conference so cool. So I know you all have a code for a discount through UXPA, which is awesome. The prices were reduced when we went virtual, and yeah, we're going to give it a go, and hopefully it's still as good as it always was. So I'm going to stop, and I could see some questions were coming in, but I wasn't able to see, I wasn't able to read them and pay attention to what I was saying. So pause now.
First of all, that was unbelievable. Oh my gosh, you have just shared with us. I just feel like it's this.
Amy, hi.
Yeah?
This is Aileen Cahill. That was a great talk, and I'm a behavioral scientist by training, gone CX, which is part of UX. I wanted to ask you, one of the things I saw in the thread that was interesting that Four brought up was, you have a behavior that leads to an outcome, but there's a 10 to 15-year gap if you're in financial services. What are some kind of think about it as pavers that you can put down for the behavior change along the way to guide to the mutually beneficial outcome?
Yeah, and that's a great example, financial services, because you're right. You're asking people to make decisions now and then not, see a return on that for decades. And a lot of times the advice you give people is also don't look at it, don't touch it, don't make changes. So, and I know we're all experiencing that right now with the fluctuation in the markets related to coronavirus. So the one thing, or not the one thing that is helpful is, sharing historical models, providing people with the evidence of why you believe this information to be correct. I've done some work with clients where they've actually created these pretty sophisticated visual modeling tools that they can sit down with somebody and actually walk them through. These are the scenarios that we predict for your money. Let's set the parameters to whatever you feel comfortable with. And one of the things that interested me when they were walking us through their tools is they have found that most of their clients prefer to look for the most conservative possible scenario. So what if everything went wrong? Like, what if I was in the worst possible situation? What would my money look like in 20, 30 years? Those sorts of tools that can make it feel a little bit more tangible are helpful. And then some of it is just having those touch points over time, reaching out to people to give them the reassurance, to, share with them stories of other people who've successfully waited the time and come out on the other side of it in the positive situation. I think it is a mistake to, do your intervention, to provide your service, provide your product up front, and then just expect people to weather the intervening decades on their own. Reaching out, having that point of contact, that touch, and building that trust is a really important way to keep people on the course.
Right, and I love your idea about modeling, about best case, worst case, most likely case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sorry, there's a lot of conversation here. Isn't Facebook seeking to create the behavior of clicking on like and friend, et cetera, and ads? Yeah, it is. And I guess I have a little bit of a bias with behavior change. Those to me feel like pretty simple behaviors. They're kind of I know they want you to repeat them over and over and over, but it's sort of a like one moment in time thing. I always think of like the really interesting behavior change interventions as driving people to do something different off the screen. And I don't think that Facebook typically in and of itself does that. Now, again, some people are using it in a way. One group that I like a lot, they're out in San Francisco, called Hope Lab, and they do a lot of work also with adolescents looking at mental health and well-being. And they have a chatbot called Vivi it's a Facebook Messenger chatbot, but that does a really nice job of trying to help people cope more positively with their moods. And I would consider that an intervention that lives within Facebook and takes advantage of Facebook's functionality. Slides, yes, I'm happy to share those. I can do an optimized PDF so that it won't kill people's emails. Yeah, Carolyn says behavior change seems to be about helping people change their own behavior in ways that they would want to change. And yes, that's a really important aspect of it, I think, because what's the beeping? It's not me, is it?
That's a new sound for me on Zoom.
Sounds like a car, like when you have your seatbelt off.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the stuff you see people do with behavior change that gets it's unfortunately getting the attention, but it's the more manipulative stuff that tricks people into getting really involved with the product. Maybe I don't like using the term addiction because I don't like muddying it with physiological addiction, but just know that I'm using it casually here. Like the addicting products are oftentimes abusing behavior change techniques to get people to do something that they didn't really fully opt into, And I think you've got to think about the long game, which is that if people will realize that, they'll wise up to it. They know that they're not spending their time in a way that they want to spend their time. And when they come around to that realization, they're going to walk away from you and your product, and they're not going to look back. Or if they do, it's going to be with a negative attitude. So I think sometimes it's about having the patience to, wait for a person to be ready and give them small things to do before they become your super user, so that when they do become your super user, they're all in with genuine emotion.
You said there were a lot of different publications and experts that you're following. I know understanding what you think is valuable would be helpful, but I love the Center for Advanced Hindsight associated with Duke University. Do you have any others that you can just like think of off the top of your head that you'd like?
Yeah, I really like Behavioral Scientist. So they do a weekly newsletter with articles, and they're on Twitter. They tweet their own stuff, but they also retweet other articles that they find. And those tend to be really good. Like they might retweet a Scientific American article that was about psychology. So that's kind of like the level of depth that they go for. There's Samuel Salzer's Habit Weekly newsletter is one of my favorites that comes every Sunday. And he, similarly does like a news roundup of various articles and things that are related to behavior change and design. I think he does a really nice job. His last week was entirely devoted to coronavirus because, as you might imagine, that's sort of taken over the conversation. Let me think. I actually like a lot of times things that are not intended to be behavior change, but end up drawing them in. So with podcasts, a lot of times the ones I listen to are like the NPR podcasts that, it will be about another subject, but they will bring in a behavior change expert to contextualize it. I really loved the recent episode of Reply All, where the guy was trying to figure out that 90s song. If you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't heard it, you should download it because it's really interesting. This guy remembered this 90s song, like remembered all the lyrics, but couldn't identify it. And they went through this really elaborate process to try to figure out what it was. And along the way, they talked a lot about, how our memory is formed and how does context affect our memory and how do we communicate memory to other people. So you learn a lot about psychology, but it's through the lens of this other story. So I tend to like those sorts of things a lot. Yeah, Tom listened to it.
Amy, can you hear me okay? It's Jill.
You're quiet, but I can hear you.
Okay, and I'll speak up louder.
Okay.
Recently, I had to do some research and, for a client project that I'm on, and got to interact with the app Noom. And listening to you tonight, it made me think about that experience that I had as I, had the conversation with it and really interacted with it for, the 14-day trial period or whatever. And I don't know what your thoughts are on the app. For me, it was this awesome experience. And I felt like it really got to, if someone wanted and was ready and sort of had some of those factors that you brought up, it would help with their behavior change. Just would love to hear your insights around if you've had any exposure to that app and thoughts around it.
Yeah, I've also done the 14-day trial. When I was writing the book, I downloaded pretty much every behavior change app I could get my hands on. I have a Google Photos album that's like 2,000 screenshots that I collected as part of the research. And I included a lot of them in the book, and I included a few of Noom, because one thing they do especially well, I think better than any other app I've seen, is helping people to articulate their goal for the product and not articulate it just like, I want to lose weight, which is, that's what it's intended for. So of course that's your goal, but really think about why, like what in your life will be benefited by that. And, really help. I was going to say forcing, and that's not the right word, because it's really helping. It's really pushing users to crystallize that so that whatever it is they come up with is really personal to them. And that is what is helpful to keep people on track with the goal. So I think that one aspect by itself, really makes me like Noom. I haven't experienced it beyond the first trial, so I can't speak to the ongoing experience of it, but man, that was really, really well done.
I agree. I could not get over the conversation and how the way that they spoke to me, it felt like it was so personal. I
Mm-hmm.
just, it blew the whole thing, the whole experience blew me away. So I'm really glad to hear. I can't wait to get your book. So
Great.
thanks for
Yeah.
sharing your insights around that.
Yeah, Jessica asks, she's curious how important it is to encourage behavior continuance and positive coaching of behaviors, like your watch telling you time to stand.
Yeah, so Amy, I'm sorry. So this is Jessica. I'm curious, do you have any stats on the stickiness of behavioral change and that the importance of encouraging continuous behavior? Because I know habits are hard to break, so curious if you have had any experience in that area.
Yeah, I don't have any stats off the cuff, but those sorts of things can be really important. So especially breaking or making habits, having that cue that is external. So if you think about the classic habit formation cycle, there's always a cue or a trigger, and something like your watch telling you to stand serves as that cue. And otherwise, what we would ask people to do is to create it for themselves, and that just introduces all these additional opportunities for them to perhaps not do it successfully. One thing that we see on the negative side is alarm fatigue or alert fatigue, where people, like every app that you download, every device that you use, it wants to give you all the notifications all the time. And it gets to be too much, so people start to ignore them. And we've actually seen this in some of our, and I know we're not the only ones who've seen this by any means, but at MadPow, we do a lot of work that is in the healthcare setting. And we see it sometimes even with medical professionals when they're in a room and there's like 6 or 7 devices that are all beeping and giving alerts. They kind of tune them all out, and that's not the desired outcome. So there is a little bit of a balance between being thoughtful about when you're pushing that prompt, hopefully at a time when a person's able to respond to it, and then not doing it so often that they start ignoring you. I think giving users some guided choice in how they do that is one way to help strike that right balance. But it's the sort of thing I think you'd really just want to look at in depth for your particular product and your particular user.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very delicate balance. I think it's kind of like in parenting, catch them being good. You want to, the timing is so essential, right? Being able to encourage positive behavior, but then discourage negative, and deliver that message at the appropriate time.
Yeah. Elizabeth, do you want to ask about your question?
Oh, you're gonna make me read? No.
I was saying questions before, and then I felt bad because I just said I wanted to talk.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't mind. I'll even turn my camera back on. So I have I jammed a bunch of questions in here. So I just bought your book.
Yay.
Thank you. Yes. So cha-ching. Did you hear the money rolling into your bank account?
I'm so wealthy from this. Believe me.
Don't you feel like it? Yeah. So let's see. I'll go in backwards order. So knowing that I've already bought your book, what is the gateway read that, aside from your own book, that you would recommend for those of us who are now have the bug and are not the coronavirus bug, the behavior, the behavior change bug, and are ready to start learning more?
Yeah, so similar to podcasts, I tend to like the ones that are maybe not, it's not like the how-to book on behavior change, but it's about something else, and it does a good job explaining along the way.
Yep.
One that I give to people a lot is Super Better by Jane McGonigal.
Okay.
Have you heard of it?
No, not that.
Okay,
not that one, but I have now.
Yeah, it's about a game that she invented. She had a serious head injury, really significant concussion, and she was unable to do anything for about 6 months. And she's, she's got a PhD, very intelligent, was used to being physically active. And all of a sudden she's in her bed and she can't read a book or watch TV. Her brain is so hurt that she can't do anything. And so she invented this really imaginative game to kind of keep her spirits up and help her cope through this difficult time. And then when she was getting better, she codified it into an actual program. And what I love about it is that it just really brilliantly incorporates motivational psychology and things like goal setting and creating milestones, bringing in social support, identifying barriers in your environment, identifying facilitators in your environment. She just does all this great behavior change stuff, but it's all in the guise of this game. So I think it's really well done, and it's really interesting even for people who maybe don't have an interest in psychology per se.
Yeah, that's interesting. So since I have the floor still, I'll pack the other question that was jammed into that chat was around, you had said that you and some other folks who were early into this field kind of had to cobble together multiple disciplines to create this behavior design discipline. So what were they? Psychology was obviously one. So what are some of the other things that you looked to?
So for me, I came through it on the job. I was working after my first job out of grad school, I was working for an agency doing research. It was whatever. But then I ended up at a startup called Health Media that was building digital health coaching. And it was very much in that startup stage where everybody did, like whatever needed doing, you pitched in. Mm-hmm. So I hired in as a content developer, but I did a lot of user acceptance testing and actually I did some like real bad visual design, and they had a behavior science team that, because I had a PhD in psychology, I kind of got swept along with. And those were the first people I ever met who were taking behavior change and applying it to product design. Because I had come in through the product organization, that's where I sat. I really just kind of started grabbing tools and information from both parts of the job and cobbling together my own position that way. So in my case, it was really very much about that on-the-job training and being lucky enough to work with a team of psychologists who, they were running. We had a huge user database. It was something like 50,000 people in our book of business database. So they had a lot of information they could use to figure out like what was effective, what wasn't effective, where is there an opportunity. And I was working with them to take that data and then transform it into actual product changes. And yeah, it was cool. It was
very cool.
Yeah,
Thank
I was
you.
very lucky.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I won't monopolize the time anymore. I know that there are other folks.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I see a question from Jackie. Did Jackie have to run? Am I baking? I am not baking today, but I'm sure I'll get back at it. I've made like 7 loaves of sourdough since all this started. My freezer is absolutely full.
I made my own mozzarella cheese.
Ooh, that sounds good.
First time cheesemaker.
Did it come out good?
It turned out great.
Nice.
It was intimidating though.
Yeah, that would intimidate me, but now's the time. Jackie asked, I think this is an interesting question. So what's your process for preparing design in order to measure successful user behavior? How do you know when you're done? Do you try to define what might be a successful user behavior and design for that, and then measure results with analytics? So we're never done, except we're kind of also done when our client tells us to. That's one of the downsides of working for a consulting organization, as I'm sure many of you know. We don't always get to fully define the bookends of our project and the full scope of it. But in an ideal world, we would never be done. We would always be, continuing that conversation with our users and iterating. One of the things that we're pretty insistent on, and again, there are sometimes clients who aren't open to this, but I think most of the time when they come to us, they know this is part of our approach and part of what makes our work as good as it is doing our own formative research, even if they already know a lot about their population, whether it's patients or consumers or whatever it is. Because that helps us to really understand the specific behaviors in the context that they will happen with respect to this particular product or project. So that oftentimes will lead us to tweak the behaviors we think are going to be important. I have a great example, and I can't talk about it because it's an ongoing project, and I don't think that we're cleared to talk about it publicly, but it was one of those things where they thought they knew what the problem was, and they were sort of right. It's an at-home biological testing kit, and we found that people are perfectionistic about it. So it's sort of like a gross test that you do for yourself, and that was getting in people's way. But even more than that, it was their concern that they weren't doing it right. And so they were procrastinating it until it was too late. And we weren't expecting that kind of twist on it. And so we were originally thinking it was all going to be about how do we do it perfectly? How do we do it neatly? How do we minimize the mess? And it turns out that it's actually more about how do we let them know a little bit of mess is okay. So that research can oftentimes be really valuable in giving us that kind of nuance or detail around what the right behavior to design for is.
Thanks, Amy. I'm here. I'm sorry. I was walking the dog on another channel, but I was still listening, and I came at the last minute. But I heard everything. Yeah. So part of what I keep trying to ask everyone, because we're doing a lot of analytics now, like we're able to measure it, and it's like, great, we can measure it now. It's like, okay, so how do we do something with it afterwards? So doing all this measuring. So and I've been reading a lot about books by processes by Jeff Gotthelf and Jeff Patton, and how they try to define what is successful user behavior up front, and then actually taking it through the whole agile process and creating experiments and so forth. And I've wanted to see that all the way through, and I'm trying to implement that now. And so I was just curious if you ever seen that and like taken it back through and redefining your experiments.
Yeah, that I don't get to do that much as a consultant. When I was in-house, we were able to do a little bit more of that. One of the things that we did a lot with our book of business data that I thought was very valuable too is sharing it back with our users sometimes. So giving them normative feedback about how others who were using the programs were behaving. And our goal with that was usually more about the social aspect of it, helping them feel like they're a part of a community as opposed to informational. Because there's always this danger of giving somebody, like basically telling somebody you're the worst. And that's never the intention. That's not a very motivational thing to do. But instead saying, you're suffering, you're struggling, but so are other people, you're not alone. And when we had, when we had the ability to actually look at our own data and say that to people like, oh my gosh, 46% of our users actually said the same thing you did. Like, did you realize that, there's a lot of people out there who feel the way you do? And we got really positive feedback from our users when they were able to feel that sort of connection with others.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
I think we have time for like 2 more questions. I think that would be good.
Yeah, and I do want to comment here on the comment, reminds me of all the emails people are sending about coronavirus. It was good at first, and now it's hard to tell what's important and not. Totally agree. I think that and it comes from a wonderful place of people wanting to help and wanting to contribute, but it is starting to get and with people who are setting up like challenges and stuff, it's almost like hard to know which are worth paying attention to. So great example. I see 4 has a question about political campaign behaviors. So I see. I mean,
yep.
Oh, there you
are.
Hi
there.
I could see you, and I didn't want to just read your question without
pressing buttons. Well, it's a broad question, but I'm just thinking about political behaviors and wondering if you've crossed the paths of any, or your thoughts about that as an area where someone in your line of work would be trying to change behavior, if there's something interesting or different about that area, or something that is informed by your experience in other areas. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, good to see you again. There are a couple of groups or products that have done some interesting work there. I think it doesn't get a lot of attention. First of all, just because I perceive politics as being a little bit of an old-fashioned type of field, if you're working within it, and also because it usually ends up being partisan, and that's not always something people are comfortable with. But there's 2 things I can think of that are behavior change related that I think are very interesting models. So one was right around the 2016 election, and it was actually Jane McGonigal, the woman who wrote Super Better. She was involved in this. But there was an app you could download called Swing Left, and the idea behind it was that you would register and then you would commit to talking to, I think it was like 2 or 3 people in your life who were undecided, or maybe voting Republican, and you would talk to them and get them to vote for Hillary Clinton. And it had structured discussion guides and sort of talking points. If they say this, you could give them this. And the idea was that that personal influence and working within your own small circle is more effective than just say going on Twitter or going on Facebook and kind of shouting into the void. So I thought that was a really interesting model, kind of empowering the individual to become a change agent within their own small circle. And then the other one, which is ongoing, it's called the Environmental Voter Project. And you may have gotten their stuff. They do a lot of door drops and mailings, but they've identified that there's basically a whole class of people who will vote for sustainability issues. That will be a top ballot issue for them. But oftentimes they're just not informed about what the right votes are to support those issues. And so what they do is they actually go and they pull voter lists. And if you are not a frequent voter, they will, there's other data they look at to identify whether or not you might be an environmental voter. They will basically make you the target of some of this outreach. So I was actually interviewed by, I think it was like Washington Magazine a couple years ago. And the reporter was specifically looking for a psychologist to comment on the Environmental Voter Project. And I'm familiar with it because we get their stuff at the house all the time, but it's always addressed to my husband. And I was saying to them, like, I think it's brilliantly designed. It's like really persuasive. It's kind of like to the point. It really connects with this value of sustainability. And I was saying, I don't know why he always gets it and I don't, because like, I really care about this stuff. And the guy said, because you vote in every election, like you're not on their list because you always go vote. Like he must miss some elections. And then the other piece of data they had on him that identified him was he was driving one of the Volkswagen TDIs with diesel, which is, or it was supposed to be, environmentally sustainable automobile. So with those two pieces of data, he became part of their database. So I thought that was a really, really interesting model and kind of an example too of what you can do with some of that big consumer data out there that doesn't feel quite as creepy as like, you know, Target sending coupons to the pregnant 16-year-old girl's house.
Thanks, Amy. Great food for thought. Really appreciate the specific examples and tying it in.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Bonus question?
Sure.
Is there, in so-called B2B businesses, is there room for this?
Room for
using, yeah, behavior design? I mean, or again, broad question. Is there something interesting to say about that as a different field than consumer businesses?
Yeah, a lot of my career was spent in B2B. When I worked for Health Media, which was acquired by Johnson & Johnson, we sold our products entirely B2B. So we were creating health coaching products that were purchased by health plans or large self-insured employers. And they were very interested in the behavior change piece specifically because they wanted programs that delivered results at scale. So we were able to say, you know, compared to something that is not built with behavior science baked into it, where we are more likely to actually get you to the results that you want to get to and give you the metrics along the way that help you feel that confidence that you're going to get there. So that's one example from my career where it has worked. And I, you know, in my consulting world, definitely see there's still interest with that B2B model.
There's a whole bunch of information on group decision processes too, right, Amy? So I think, you know, it's B2B to C is what you just answered, but if your customer is actually another business, there's group decision making behavioral science.
Yeah,
Right.
there is.
That's what I was thinking about. You put it much better. Thank you.
Yeah, there is. I haven't had as much experience with that. I know there's another area too around, you know, B2B for more like HR and people management purposes, which I guess still has these individual end users in an organization. But those, I tend not to be able to find as many examples of those because it's so closed loop. You know, those are really proprietary solutions. And if you don't work for an organization that has one or that makes one, you don't get to see it.
Any examples, Eileen?
So my opinion, right? In my humble opinion, a lot of the behavioral science starts in B2C, and B2B is so precious about being different that they've like haven't jumped on the train and it's left the station. So rather than thinking about how precious and different they are, they should think about that it's still people making the decision and people buying from people they like, and think about the 80% that's the same versus the 20% that's different.
I think you see a lot of social wellness apps too, and companies are interested in retaining their employees. They save a lot of money that way, and so you see, we've seen a lot of development of social wellness apps like meditation, and just trying to keep employees satisfied and engaged. However, and healthy. So I think that's a real positive initiative happening in B2B.
Yeah. I don't know a lot about I haven't seen the solution, but I have known some people who've worked on it. Batter Up is one company that is doing that kind of stuff that I've heard good things about.
All right, well, we're going to wrap it up. Amy, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for attending. If you guys want to continue the conversation, the Slack workspace and the channel for tonight's presentation, we can keep going on there, and we'll cut Amy loose and everybody else that needs to get going. And with that, also definitely chime in on the channel and tell us what you thought worked tonight, what didn't work, or any challenges that you had with doing our first virtual meeting. We want to dial this in, and we're obviously looking for all kinds of input and recommendations for how we can streamline this. So that's it. Thank you, everybody. And sorry. We forgot to thank our sponsor, Market Street Talent. So definitely check them out, marketstreettalent.com. Jay Robichaud is typically at our meetings. Great guy, straight shooter, will always give you the lowdown on your resume, on your job candidacy for anything that you're interested in. And he is your advocate. He's going to help shape you up and prepare you for what you need to do to get that job you're interested in, or give you an opportunity at other jobs that he may find as a better fit. So again, thank you to Market Street Talent. Thank you, Amy. And thank you, everybody, for coming out to NHUXPA tonight.
Yeah, and it is recorded, so we're going to release that.
Well,
right. Bye, everyone.
And I'll send you the slides so that you can share them however you normally do.
Okay, what we're going to try and do, we're going to try and put it all on the NHUXPA website for tonight's meeting. Perfect. So hopefully we'll have a download for the files there and for the slide deck. If you want to just do like a PDF of that, whatever, that would be great.
Yep, and I'm going to add in, I have a slide I put together, or a couple slides with books and podcasts that I like, so I'll just add those in the back.
Awesome.
Cool.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great conversation.
Bye.
Bye.